Boker Tov. Good morning. Good morning. And welcome to this week's greatest Bible story. We're going to be studying, we're going to continue in the book of Samuel, or we're in 1 Samuel right now, the first part of the book of Samuel. We'd like to welcome those who are joining us via our YouTube channel. We welcome you in the name of the Lord. We're glad that you found us and are able to join us, and we give thanks to God for the gift of technology that enables us to do this. Let us begin this morning with a word of prayer. Almighty God, our Heavenly Father, without your help, our labor is useless. And without your light, our search is in vain. Invigorate our study of your holy word, that by due diligence and right discernment we may establish ourselves and others in your holy faith. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. All right. So, this week's story is the story. We met him last week. So you remember last week we studied the story of God, but Samuel anointing David, right? So God is going to take the kingdom away from Saul. That was the king that the people wanted. That's the one God gave to the people of Israel to be their king. And you'll remember that Saul is head and shoulders above every other Israelite, and he's also a very handsome man. So you sort of get this vision of a sort of charismatic personality. God's going to take the kingdom away from Saul, though, because Saul is not following Yahweh, not doing the things that Yahweh would have him do. And so he sends Samuel to anoint David, the youngest son of 8, the youngest son of Jesse the Ephrathite, who lives in the village town of Bethlehem. Okay, so that just a quick recap of where we're at, and then our story for today is going to be the story of that David fights Goliath. And if you've ever been through Sunday school, and probably even if you didn't go to Sunday school, you probably know the general outline of this story. But it's from 1 Samuel chapter 17. So that'll be the basis of today's lesson, and we might get a little farther in our study. Now, we're going to encounter some things in this chapter that as Westerners, so we finished up last week with chapter 16, and I'm going to read the last couple verses of it just before we get to today's story. But we're going to encounter some things in this chapter where, as Westerners, we're like, this doesn't make any sense, right? It doesn't, we tend to think of, when we read, we tend to read linearly, meaning this event took place, and then this event, and then this event, even though we know there's literary devices like flashbacks and foreshadowing and things like that, right? But Semitic writing is different. So the Hebrew is one of the Semitic languages, and Semitic writing is circular. So oftentimes, at the end of a section of Scripture, you'll have sort of a big picture overview and conclusion. And then the next part that takes place is going into more detail in something that's already happened, right? It's sort of zooming in on something that's taken place. And so let's go to 1 Samuel chapter 16, and we'll read the last part of the last verse. The last verse. And whenever the harmful spirit from God was upon Saul, David took the lyre and played it with his hand. So Saul was refreshed and was well, and the harmful spirit departed from him. So it's actually before that. Where David is going to enter his service. And David, so it's verse 21. And David came to Saul and entered his service. And Saul loved him greatly, and he became his armor bearer. And Saul sent to Jesse, saying, "Let David remain in my service, for he has found favor in my sight." Okay, and then the part I just read. So we get the picture, the Semitic conclusion of the reference of the harmful spirit that comes upon Saul, and the only thing that can soothe Saul is music, evidently being played by the hand of David. Not evidently played by the hand of David, but evidently only by David, is the soothing part of this. But he's going to be in Saul's service, and we sort of just keep that in mind, right? What we're going to encounter in this next section, this next chapter, I should say, is that we're going to encounter some language where, we're shaking our head, okay? because it doesn't make sense the way we think and the way we read history. But, all right, now, chapter 17. Now the Philistines. Now, it's time to do a deep review, right? Remember that every single person on earth are descendants at this time in history from one family unit, Noah, his wife, and his 3 sons and their wives, right? They repopulate the earth. So the Philistines are related to Noah's son, one of Noah's sons, okay? And so this is a people group. Now, they're living in the land, the land of promise that God promised to Abraham and his descendants. And they're enemies of God, as we've already encountered several times. Now, the Philistines gathered their armies for battle. And they gathered at Succoth, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Succoth and Azekah in Ephes Damim. Okay, so let's just go to our map for just a quick brief second. So remember, just to give us a picture, orient us in space, Jerusalem is due west of the north end of the Salt Sea, the Dead Sea, right? Jerusalem is right here. Bethlehem is just to the southeast southeast of Jerusalem, right here. And Succoth is located over here. So on the big map, it's sort of between the J and the U of Judah. All right, so this just locates us in space. This region over here along the Great Sea, the Mediterranean, what we call the Mediterranean Sea today, is the area of Philistia. This is where the Philistines would dwell and where they ruled. But periodically, as we've encountered several times in some of our stories, the Philistines would come into Judah. Now, Judah is one of the 12 tribes of Israel. This was their allotment of land in the southern portion, and the tribe of Simeon was in the midst of them, in the middle of them. So it would be sort of like making raids, right? They would come in to pillage the land of Judah. Okay, so let's go back to the center and press the right button there, or remember to press the right button. So just to locate us. So the Philistines are going to come to do battle. And when you come to do battle, what do you bring? All your forces, right? You don't leave anybody at home. You don't take any chances, right? So they bring their forces to go to war. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah and drew up in the line of battle against the Philistines. So one country comes to war, their king and their military forces come, and then the other country goes out to meet them, or you're going to be destroyed in battle. So King Saul goes out with his people to do battle with the Philistines. Now remember that King Saul, as I mentioned earlier, is head and shoulders above every other Israelite, right? And he's a handsome man. He's got this cult of personality, if you will, with the people. There we go. Sorry. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. And he had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. And his shield bearer went before him. Let's just stop there for a minute. Okay. So let's get the full picture of Goliath of Gath, okay? And so, now, some people who want to be critics of the Bible would take this description of this man as a fantastical, not as in great, but as in fantasy, okay? And we're going to see why. So, a cubit, according to the biblical measurements, is about 18 inches. Strictly speaking, it's about the length from the tip of your finger to the elbow, which is about 18 inches. And so that's also 1.5 feet. And so 6 cubits is 9 feet, but it's 6 cubits and a span. So he's over 9 feet tall. This man is over 9 feet tall. Now, just to put that in perspective, my wife says I'm shrinking. Well, she said I was shrinking, right? And my son says I'm shrinking. I think he's just... Anyway. So to put it in perspective for you, and I measured, 9 feet is from the top of that bracket down to the floor. Okay, so he's 9+ feet tall. This is not a small man. This is a giant, right? And some people think that this is impossible, that any human being could be this tall, right, or this large. But we believe that God's word is inerrant. It's truthful. It's without error, divinely inspired. So we take it for what it is. Now, some of us remember a gentleman, a professional athlete, if you want to, I'm going to put athlete in quotation marks. Andre the Giant, right? He was a professional wrestler. Andre the Giant was a really big man. Now, he was not 9 feet tall, right? But giantism is something we encounter in the world around us. So it's not unheard of. So we shouldn't just dismiss this because I've never seen someone who's 9 feet tall, right? But this is what people want to do. All right, so now, he's 9+ feet tall. It's about 9.5 feet tall, the span. And the span is about the hand, right? Is about a span. So he's about 9.5 feet tall. So, and his armor, the coat of mail that he wore, so he goes out to battle and he's well equipped. He has a helmet for his head. He has a coat of chain mail made out of bronze. And the chain mail, we learn, weighs 6,000 shekels. And a shekel is 2/5 of an ounce. So when you do the biblical math, you come out that his armor weighed about 125 pounds. Just the coat of mail, right? And so if you ever tried to lift 125 pounds, you know that that depending on your strength, your physical strength, that may or may not be easy for one to do, right? But just imagine carrying a child around on your shoulders all day long, right? So a toddler to a preschool, first, second, third grader, or maybe even a little older on your shoulders. Just imagine what that would be like, right? I remember when Damien was really young and he didn't want it, he was doing something he wasn't supposed to do, so you go to pick him up, and every child has the ability to gain weight immediately, right? They become completely limp, right? And somehow they feel like they're heavier than they actually are, right? My cat has the same effect. But anyway, so his coat of mail weighs about 125 pounds, and the spearhead that was on his spear weighs approximately 14.5 pounds. So this is a guy who's got some serious, because of his size, he can carry serious weights, and he's going to protect himself. So from head to toes, he wears metal shin guards, right, on his legs, right? And the reason for that is so he can't be cut with a sword on his legs. The chainmail protects from his shoulders down to, usually it's kind of mid-calf, or you don't want it to go close to the knee. Why? Ladies, is it easy to run in a dress? No. Harold, I didn't ask the men. You shouldn't know, all right? Okay, right? But usually, if I try to run in my alb, which is not a dress, it's an alb, right? Your feet get caught up in the hem, right? And so usually, if someone has to run and they're wearing a long garment that has a sort of a billowing effect, like a gown or an alb, you pick it up, right, to make it easier. So the chainmail typically would stop around mid-thigh, above the knee, to make it easy to move. All right, so he's got all this armor, and his spearhead is slung between his shoulders, and the shaft of it's like a weaver's beam, and so it looks. It's not that it's actually a weaving loom, but it has probably has the shape thereof. Okay, so this is how he's protected in battle, right? So he goes out, and when he goes out to battle, he wears his armor. And he's a very large, strong man, as we're going to see as we go forward. All right, so that's our depiction of Saul, the biblical depiction of Saul, and what he wears in battle. Now, we're going to encounter the description of the battle. And the description of the battle, it might be better if every single battle that ever took place on earth followed this format, right, as we'll see. But they don't. So, notice, recall that both armies are standing where? on opposite mountains. One's drawn up against the other. So the Philistines are over here, the Israelites are over here, and if there's two mountains here, what's in between? Oh, some type of valley, right? Some type of valley. So, Saul, and his shield bearer went before him. So, not only did he have all this armor, he had some guy who went out with him to carry just his shield alone. He stood and Goliath, stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistines said, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistines, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. So Saul comes out. He's the designated champion of the Philistines. And evidently, at this time in history, battles were often fought mano a mano, one-on-one. And so the champion of the one side would fight the champion of the other side, and whatever champion won, that country, that people group were the victors, right? So Goliath comes out to the Israelites, and we're going to, as we go through this, we'll get this image of this happens. It's not just once, but it happens on multiple occasions. So the Philistines have come into the land of Judah. They're drawn up. They're ready for war. Saul and his forces have come out to meet them. And Goliath says, "What's the deal, right? Are you not here to do war? Are you not here to do battle, right? I'm the champion of the Philistines. Pick your man and let's get this thing done," right? He wants to go home, evidently. That's a paraphrase. All right. So he says, pick your champion. Now, who's the biggest, baddest guy amongst the Israelites? Should be King Saul, right? Because he's the biggest. He's the largest guy. He's the king, and the king usually leads the forces out to battle, as we'll see, as we look at biblical stories involving battles. So Saul should have been the champion of the Israelites. He's the biggest, tallest, most handsome of the guys, and yet where's Saul? Well, we don't know, but we do know he's not coming out to the front lines, right? He's not coming out there. So Saul sort of he's not trying to pick a fight. The fight's already started, right, in that sense. But he's trying to get the battle, engage them in battle, and he says, pick your champion. And here's the deal. If your champion wins, if he defeats me, we will be your servants. But if I win, we will have the victory, and you will be our vassal, our servants. Okay? But the Israelites, what's their reaction? They're dismayed and greatly afraid. Now, in the Septuagint, the word for fear, it's yirah in Hebrew, but it's in Greek, it's similar to an English word that we all know. It's phobeo, which sounds a lot like phobia. So this would be the kind of fear where knees are knocking, right? And as my Greek professor would say, they phobeoed in their pants. Okay? 9.5 feet tall, giant spear, coat of mail, and a big, big sword, right? Because, a giant's not going to wield a little kitchen knife, right? So a big sword, even though we don't know the size of it. So, but the people of God were dismayed and afraid. Now, and this is a rhetorical question, I'm going to give you the answer. Who actually led the Israelites anytime they went into battle? If they took them with them, God did. Right? God was the one. He's the king. He is the king of his people. Right? They wanted an earthly king, but he was the true king. And he was the one who went out and fought their battles, as long as they were doing it as he instructed them, right, and commanded them. When they took matters into their own hands, God didn't go with them, right? But the people were dismayed and afraid. Okay, so there's the scene. You've got the military forces on the two mountains. We get the image that every day Saul's coming out and throwing down the proverbial gauntlet in front of the Israelites, challenging them to pick their man so we can do battle and get this settled. Now David, now remember, as we reviewed from the last chapter, at the end of the last chapter, King Saul sent word to his father Jesse that asking that David be in his service forever, right, all the time. And now we're going to hear, this is the part where we're going to read next, where we might be scratching our head a little bit, wondering what's going on. So now David was the son of an Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judah, named Jesse, who had 8 sons. In the days of Saul, the man was already old, so Jesse was already old, and advanced in years. The 3 eldest sons of Jesse had followed Saul to the battle. And the names of his 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab, the firstborn, and next to him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. So let's stop there for a minute, because, we'll read a little bit more. The 3 eldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. For 40 days, the Philistine came forward and took his stand. Came forward and took his stand morning and evening. So twice a day for 40 days, Saul would come out and throw down the proverbial challenge to the Israelites. But they were dismayed and afraid. Now, so here what we learn is that David is in the service of King Saul, but at this time, he's still going back and forth to home. This would be like you commuting to work. If you had a job, you were out of town, maybe you work in construction and your construction company was out of town, they're doing a job out of town, so you would go to work during the week and then you'd probably come home, maybe if it wasn't too far away, on the weekends, right? Kind of thing. So David is in the service of King Saul, but he's not staying there all the time. He's still going back and forth to his father's house. Now we learn that the 3 eldest boys have followed Saul into battle. So that means that all 3 of these boys are no longer boys. They're males, but they're adults. So they're at least 20 years of age, right? Because in the Bible, biblical manhood is 20. And when you turn 20, then you can go serve in the military. When you get to be a certain age, you stop serving in the military, right? You're retired. And so Jesse is at the age where he can no longer go into battle, but his 3 eldest sons are old enough where they can go. And so they follow King Saul. So they're there at the encampments of the Israelites, and they too are amongst this group of people that are hearing these for 40 days. For 40 days, every morning and every evening, the Philistine. So notice that the Bible doesn't, we've heard his name once, but more often than not, the Bible refers to him as the Philistine, right? And the Philistines are uncircumcised people, as we're going to see. They're not part of God's covenant people. So, but the eldest 3 sons of Jesse are there at the battle site, and they're amongst those that are dismayed and greatly afraid. And David is going back and forth between serving King Saul and going home to attend to his father and his needs. And Jesse, so one day when David was at home, Jesse said to David his son, "Take for your brothers an ephah of this parched grain and these 10 loaves, and carry them quickly to the camp to your brothers. Also take these 10 cheeses to the commander of their 1,000. See if your brothers are well, and bring some token from them." So Dad, no cell phones, no TV, no landlines, no postal service, no newspapers. The only way to get word is to send a messenger. So Dad is concerned about the welfare of his 3 eldest sons, and so he sends the youngest, who's not, we don't know exactly how old he is, but we know he has to be under what age? Under 20. Because he's not there at the battle, right? So he's not, biblically speaking, a man yet. So Dad sends the youngest son with food items to give to his 3 eldest sons, and also sends a gift to the commander of their 1,000. So they're in the midst of I don't know what you'd call that, I guess military, maybe a battalion kind of concept in our modern day parlance. But he sends a gift of cheese to the commander. Now, why did he do that? Well, every father is concerned about his children, right? And he wants to make sure that the commander-in-chief looks after his sons. So he sends them a gift of encouragement, if you will. So he sends the youngest with these things to get word of how things are going and the state of the health and well-being of his 3 eldest sons. All right, so David, being the good son that he is, he takes these things and he goes. Now Saul and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. And so this is, again, not that a battle was ensuing, but they were there to do battle, right? Now Saul and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. And David rose early in the morning and left the sheep with the keeper and took the provisions and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the encampment as the host was going out to the battle line, shouting the war cry. So, evidently, we get a little better picture of how this happens each day. So in the morning and the evening, Goliath and the Philistine emissaries, if you will come to the place in the valley, and then Saul and the Israelites, their emissaries, would come to the place in the valley, and they would shout at each other. But no actual fighting is taking place, right? Goliath continues to challenge to throw down the proverbial gauntlet to the Israelites, and we're going to hear their reaction. Well, we heard their reaction a little bit already, but we'll hear more of it. So David rose early in the morning and left the sheep with the keeper and took the provisions and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the encampment as the host was going out to the battle line, shouting the war cry. And Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army. And David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage and ran to the ranks and went and greeted his brothers. So he arrives, and what he arrives to is the armies coming together and shouting cries of war, and he wants to go and see. Everybody's out there, so he knows his brothers are there, so he leaves everything with the baggage handler, the guy who's supposed to watch over the camp, basically, and he goes out to the front lines. As he talked with them, his brothers, behold, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before. Which are those words? Well, it goes back to, why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you are not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us. So every day, twice a day, this is happening over and over and over again. And David heard him. David heard the words that Goliath spoke. All the men of Israel when they saw the man, that is the Philistine, the giant, they fled from him and were much afraid. Right? Not just dismayed and very afraid, but much afraid. Now they're actually retreating from the line of battle. Right? They're shying away. And the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who has come up? Now, we've been reading the story, so we know this has been going on for 40 days. Right? This is not the first time. But in the face of adversity, sometimes it's easier to do what? Give in, give up, right, than actually persevere. So now, as these 40 days have gone on, the people are getting more and more afraid of what's happening, of Goliath. Have you seen this man who's come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel, and the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches, and will give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel. And David said to the men who stood by him, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him in the same way. So shall it be done to the man who kills him. So can you get the picture? They're there to do battle. Goliath issues the challenge again. The people are fleeing from the front lines. They're moving back. In the military, how do you get voluntold? Well, everybody takes, they say whoever's going to volunteer, take a step forward, right? Your platoon mates take a step back, right? And you're left in the front, right? So the people now are saying, they're trying to encourage somebody to go out, and they put they sweeten the pot, right, as they say. They say, certainly the king, whoever defeats this one, whoever defeats this Philistine, certainly the king will do all these great things for him. Now, King Saul should have been the one. Now, the soldiers are trying to encourage one another. Hey, if you go and beat him, the king's going to set your family free if you're in servitude. The king will certainly give you his daughter to marry. You're going to be part of the royal household, right? How great would that be? Have I got a deal for you? It's the way that's working out, right? As they flee the battlefield and are very much afraid. So David, this young boy, who's not a man yet according to biblical standards, the youngest of 8 sons, is there, and he hears the challenge of Goliath, and he hears and sees and witnesses the response of his fellow countrymen, and he asks a question. Well, what will the king do for the one who kills this uncircumcised Philistine? Right? Who's defying, now notice David's language, the living God. So God is not a dead God. God is a living God, and a living God is supposed to be present with his people. And so we're going to learn, we've already gotten a glimpse into David's beliefs, right, about who God is, who Yahweh is, and what he can do, as we'll see as we go forward. All right. So the people said, well, surely the king will do those things for the man who kills him, right? Now, if you defeat him, that's one thing, but if you kill him, surely the king will do that for the person who does that. Now, Eliab, David's eldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men. So he's in near proximity. He can hear David speaking. And Eliab's anger was kindled against David. And he said, "Why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle." He thinks he's shirking his duties, right, as the youngest of the household. So, being a tender of sheep is not the most coveted job. Shocker, right? Because you got to stay out in the fields day and night. You're around filthy animals and dumb animals, right? So you're always trying to protect them and keep them safe. So it's not the coveted job of jobs. But Eliab, his eldest brother, thinks that he's shirking his duties. And David says, "What have I done now?" Right? Now, I'm the youngest of 5. Many of you, I've said that before, so many of you know that. And usually, where does stuff roll down? Well, it always rolls downhill, and the youngest is at the bottom. Right? And so the jobs that no one likes, you do. Right? The youngest one does. Now, so Eliab, the oldest brother, thinks that his youngest brother is up to no good, and he never does what he's supposed to do. Now, I don't know if my brother and the 3 sisters and then me, I don't know if my brother felt that way about me or not. I couldn't say, but he thinks that he's not doing what he's supposed to do. So he thinks he's just come down to witness this event that's taking place, the battle, right? And we get the impression from David's response, "What have I done now?" That this isn't the first time that this has happened with his older brother, right? So from David's perspective, nothing he does satisfies his older brother. Was it not but a word? Did I not just ask a simple question? We might say. And he turned away from him, from his brother, toward another and spoke in the same way, and the people answered him as before. So we get this ongoing conversation. You get this mental image of David sort of walking amongst the troops, talking to anybody who will listen, right? What is it that the king will do for the one who kills this one? Now, you could maybe make the argument that this young child, from their perspective, because he's not a man yet, he's not a young child the way we think of that word, but he's not age of manhood yet. And you would think that you might get the idea that he's trying to maybe shame them, right? He's trying to encourage them. This little one in their midst is trying to encourage them to do what they're supposed to do as soldiers or as military men out to fight a battle. So he's walking through the troops asking these questions. And they answered him again as before. When the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. Now we're coming up on another one of those sections of scriptures where we might do one of those head-scratching events. Just be prepared for that. So word gets back to Saul. So the soldiers are talking about this young one who's in their midst asking these questions, and word gets back to Saul, and Saul sends for him for David. And David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fall because of him." Now, remember, we've heard it twice. They were in great fear. They fled from Goliath, and they were very afraid. Right? They were dismayed, very greatly afraid, and were much afraid, as we heard. And so when David says, "Let no man's heart fall," what he's really talking about is, you guys shouldn't be acting this way. You shouldn't be afraid of this man. And we're going to learn why. Let no man's heart fall because of him. Your servants will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth." So Saul looks at David. Remember, he's been in his service. He knows who he is. He knows his relative age. And he remember how David is described as a young man of ruddy appearance and handsome, right? Certainly not 9+ feet tall. A man who's seasoned in battle, right? And Saul says, "You can't possibly go out to war against this man." Now David says this. David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father." It customarily keeps sheep for his father. You might think of it that way. And when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. This is what the shepherds are supposed to do, to protect the flock, right, from human forces as well as animal forces. But I struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he rose against me, if he got back up, right, if that wasn't enough, I caught him by his beard. That would be the stuff down here, right, below the neck, right, where the animal fur is. He grabbed him and struck him and killed him. Now, you might get the image of a human being that this was probably, well, the first time you read it, you might get the image of he grabs him, by the scruff of the neck with one hand and hits him with another punch, the death-dealing blow, but it's probably a club, or a stick or staff or something like that, some instrument in his hand, and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. So again, we get this phrase of the living God. He's a God, so to be alive means you're present, you're with your people. So God is there. And we're hearing David's confession about who he is and what he does. And David said, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." So how is that for a great deal, right? The king of Israel, who's supposed to go out to battle, is going to send one who's not qualified by an age commandment from God. He's going to send him out to battle and say, "Okay, go ahead, Lord be with you." Right? Now David believes what? God will be with him and God will give him the victory. Right? He knows that he's not going to do it. He's confessing. He's confessed to his brothers. He's confessed to all those soldiers that he's talked to, and he's confessed to God to Saul exactly who is going to give him the victory. It's not him. God has delivered him from the mouths of lions and bears. And God will be the one, the living God will be the one to deliver him from the hand of the Philistine, from this 9+ foot giant. All right. And so Saul sends him out, says, okay, go ahead. Lord be with you. Yahweh be with you. Then Saul clothed David with his armor. Now remember, David, young lad, I won't say a boy, but young lad, not an adult male yet. Saul, head and shoulders above everybody else. Okay? Then Saul clothed David with his armor. So the king puts his own armor on David. He put a helmet of bronze on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail. And David strapped his sword, that is Saul's sword, over his armor. And he tried in vain to go, for he had not tested them. All right, so by testing here, he had not. This was the first time that he's ever tried them on. Now, when you were a child, did you ever play dress up? Right, you wanted to be like your parents. Right, you wanted to be an adult. So you might have gotten out your dad's suit, right, coat or pants or something, and you might have gotten, if you're a lady, you might have gotten out of your mother's dress, your favorite dress or something. You try to put on her high heels, right? And you want to look like mom and dad to be a grown-up. And how did that work? You were falling all over the place, right? You're tripping over the pant legs or the hem of the gown, and you're rolling your ankle over in the high heel shoes and all those things. And so David has never worn this armor, and it's not made for him. It's made for Saul. Armor is specific, just much like it's sort of like a tailored suit, right? Because it's meant for that person to protect them. And so when Saul puts this armor on David, it's not that he's incapable of using it. It's very awkward for him. Okay, it's uncomfortable. He's not able to move freely, and he's never worn armor before. I've yet to see a single shepherd who's out in the field wearing a suit of armor, right? But, so he's out, Saul puts it on him, he tries it on, but he tried in vain to go, but he had not tested them. Then David said to Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. Meaning, I can't use these, right? They're not made for me. So David put them off. Then he took his staff in his hand. That would be the thing that he probably uses when he whacked the bear or the lion in the head, right, to kill it. And chose 5 smooth stones from the brook. So in the valley, there's a small brook of water, and if you have running water, oftentimes stones get rounded by just the abrasion of the water over the course of time. So he picks up 5 smooth stones out of the brook, and he puts them in a little pouch on his hip, and he's got a sling, as we're going to hear. He put them in his shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. So do you have the image? 9.5 feet, somewhere up there by the bottom of that black banner up there. Goliath in all of his armor, with his shield bearer out in front of him. And David goes out there with what? A staff, a pouch of 5 stones, and a sling in his hand. That's all he got. And we're going to see what happens. Well, you already know what happens, I'm sure. But and the Philistine moved forward and came near to David, with his shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. So Goliath comes out to see who the Israelites have finally put forward to be their champion, and what does he see? A little kid, right? He's ruddy in appearance and handsome. Now, and the Philistine said to David, Am I a dog that you have come to me with sticks? Spear, sword strapped on his hip, and David's out there with a staff. Now, usually, how tall is a staff? Usually about as tall as the person, right? So, if you wouldn't walk around with a 9-foot staff, right, if you're 4 feet tall. Why? Because it's going to be hard to control, handle. Right? So he accuses David of treating him like a dog. Right? Because it's absurd to him that this little guy, little boy, little lad, young youth is the champion of the Israelites. How dare you? Right? Do you think that little of me that you send out a kid to do battle with me? Am I a dog that you have come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. Now, cursed David by his gods would probably mean he pronounced a curse upon David, invoking the name of one of the Philistine gods. Right? Probably not using foul language. There could have been, we don't know. But it probably means pronouncing a curse upon him. Right? So, not that any of you good Christians would ever say this. And I'm going to use an illustration. God damn you to hell. Right? That would be a curse, where you're invoking God's name on someone, that he would send them to a place of eternal separation. And this is why we would never do that, as we learn in Luther's explanation of the second commandment. But Goliath places a curse upon David. Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field. Goliath, the Philistines, the uncircumcised Philistines, telling David he's going to slaughter him, and he's going to leave his body out in the field of battle for the birds and the animals. They're going to come and they're going to gnaw on your flesh. Okay? Then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord, Yahweh, saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. So Goliath pronounces a curse, and he tells David he's going to slaughter him and leave his body in the field of battle for the birds and the animals. And David's reply is what? Oh, yeah? Right? Oh, yeah? Well, let me tell you what's going to happen. Right? God is going to give you into my hand, and not just you. I'm going to kill you. I'm going to cut off your head, but you won't be the only one. The hosts of the Philistines will also litter the field. Yahweh, the Lord of hosts, the living God, is going to give us the victory, David says. All right? David confesses that he's not the one he's the instrument, but he's not the one who's going to get this victory. It's going to be Yahweh. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that Yahweh saves not with sword or spear. So how does Yahweh save? By faith, by trusting in him. That's how Yahweh is going to save his people. David trusts that Yahweh is going to do this. And notice that this is a form of evangelism, much like we saw in Egypt, right? When God got the victory over the Egyptian gods. He was evangelizing to the Egyptians, letting them know that he is the true God. We skipped over the chapter, but if you took the challenge and read it, when the Philistines captured the Ark of the Covenant, they took it back to their temple, the Temple of Dagon, and put it in there. And a bunch of bad stuff happened to the statue of Dagon while the Ark of the Covenant was in that temple. Right? It fell down, broke its foot off, hands off. They were placed. The statue was over one part of the room, and the head and the hands were at the threshold. Right? Now that doesn't happen by itself usually. Right? So God is present in that room, and he gets the victory over Dagon. And so God is revealing his power and might to other people. And also now, who's the assembly that David might be surreptitiously referring to without pointing any fingers? The Israelites. Right? The people of God should know that they have a God who's going to give them the victory. Right? But what have they been doing for 40 days? Knees knocking, shaking, and quivering, right, in their boots. Right? They were wearing sandals, not boots, but you get the image. Right? They didn't trust that Yahweh would give them the victory. And so God is going to show them that He's a living God and that He saves by faith, by trusting in Him. It's not the sword, it's not the shield, it's not the spear, it's Yahweh who gives the victory. For the battle is Yahweh's, and He will give you into our hand. So God is going to use this event, the battle that's about to take place, to show the Philistines that, whoever in ancient times, whatever country won, their God was stronger than the God of the other country. So when Yahweh gives them the victory in battle, everybody knows that God is stronger than our gods because we lost, right? But it's also for the Israelites. All right. When the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. So this is like the child running out into the streets or the interstate, right? Everybody would be freaking out, appropriately so, right? But the child's just running into danger from the human perspective. David is running into danger, but he goes forward, out to meet him. He rushes out to meet him. And David put his hand in his bag, in his shepherd's pouch, and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. So a sling is basically a leather, two leather strips that has a wider leather piece at the back. You'd put the stone in there and you swing it around like this and then release, not the whole thing, but release one end of it, and it would sort of be like an arrow from a bowstring, right? The stone would go forward and hit the target. And we learn that the stone hits the forehead of Goliath, the uncircumcised Philistine, the giant, and he falls to the ground. So there's enough force behind this to knock, did he fall forward, backward? We don't know, right? He falls to the ground. And then what happens? Well, so David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone and struck the Philistine and killed him. So the stone not only knocked him down, but it killed him as well. He's dead. There was no sword in the hand of David, right, because he's got the staff in one hand, couldn't handle Saul's sword. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. So he goes to the fallen Philistine, he pulls his sword out. Now, Goliath's sword's got to be bigger than Saul's. So you would think that how in the world could David, this young youth, handle that sword? But God evidently gives him the strength and the ability to draw it out of its sheath, to pick it up over his back. So if you've ever chopped wood, do you chop wood with your axe like this or like this? Well, you do it like that, right? Because you want the axe to go through the wood, right? Graphic image, I know, and so this is one of those stories for adults, right? In Sunday school, they didn't do this part of the story, right? Because it would traumatize children, understandably so. But David cuts off his head with his own sword. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, our big man is down, he's headless, he's dead, they fled. They fled the place of battle. And the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron. So the wounded Philistines fell on the way from Sha'arim as far as Gath and Ekron. So they're fleeing the battle now. Now the Israelite army, right? Goliath's dead. Okay, it's good. We're ready. Now they're going to chase them, and anybody they chase, they kill. Right? So bodies are dropping along the way back as they flee to their homeland. And David took the people of Israel, and the people of Israel came back from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their camp. So they didn't even stop to take the stuff that they brought with them. They've been camping there for 40 days and 40 nights at least. Right? They just fled the field of battle with whatever they had on. Right? And now, when the Israelite army comes back, they get the spoils of war. All right? And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem. Now, at this time in history, Jerusalem is not the capital of the people of God, right? Jerusalem is the Jebusites live in Jerusalem. Saul was at Gibeah, right? And that's where his home was. And so he brings this head of the Philistines to Jerusalem, which is a place where non-Israelites lived. What might that be? This is what happens to the enemies of God's people. Be ready, right? You might be next. But we learned that he took the armor and where am I? My page turned, I think. No. Where am I? Okay. Thank you. He cut off, said, the man of Israel, but he took the armor in his tent. So he took the armor here is Saul's armor. So this is David's trophy, right, if you will. He took that back to the place where he dwelled in his tent. As soon as Saul saw David go out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, and again, this is going to be one of those head scratchers. He said to Abner, the commander of the army, Abner, whose son is this youth? And you're like, what? He just met with him. He just tried to give him his armor. How in the world does he not know who he is? Now remember, Saul is plagued by this evil spirit. We don't know what that's doing to his mental state, but it torments him. So perhaps because of that, he's struggling to remember things. We don't know, but we'll just take it for what it is. He asks his commander-in-chief, who's this youth? And Abner, the commander-in-chief, says, as your soul lives, O king, I do not know. And the king said, inquire whose son the boy is. And as soon as David returned from striking down the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. So we had a Semitic wrap-up, right? We learned that David took the head of the Philistine to the city of Jerusalem. And now we're coming back to get some more information, a little more detail here in this last little bit of chapter 17. So they bring him before Saul, and Saul said to him, whose son are you, young man? And David answered, I am the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite. Okay. And it's one of those things where we read that, and because we've read the whole story, we're kind of wondering what in the world is going on. So is it that Saul is suffering from short-term memory loss? We could come up with lots of potential medical explanations, but we should just take it for what it is, that he's having trouble remembering who people are. So David, doesn't insult the king, right? He doesn't tell him, dude, you just gave me your armor, not that long ago. How is it they can't remember? He doesn't insult him. He just says, I am the son of Jesse the Bethlehemite, your servant. All right? So, David now, as we've already learned, he's in the service of Saul, but now David has gained some notoriety. David has just slain the champion of the Philistines in front of who? Everybody. Everybody saw the little youth go out to battle and wipe out the giant. Okay? And that's going to change things. So next week when we come back together, we're going to tackle the story, not tackle, but we're going to study the story of Jonathan and David. And Jonathan is Saul's son. So if you're the son of the king, what does that make you? A prince and probably the heir apparent, the next in line. Okay? So we'll pick up next time with chapter 18, and we're going to do chapter 20. You might want to read chapter 19. We're going to skip over that in our narrative, but it's important information in there. So we'll be doing chapters 18 and 20 next week with the story of Jonathan and David, or David and Jonathan, depending on who you want to put first. And we'll address a common critique next time. So we'd like to thank those who joined us via our YouTube channel. We pray that the Lord would keep us safe and secure in His mighty right hand until we see one another again, whether that's next Sunday or via our YouTube channel or perhaps face-to-face. And don't forget that our worship service will start at 10:15. So God's blessings on the rest of your day, and hope you can join us for worship. There is coffee and cranberry orange bread in the back. All right, so made by my own hand, and I don't know if that frightens you or not, but it's there. All right. Greetings.